A fire rips through a garment factory in Bangladesh, killing 112 workers. No emergency exits, no way to escape. A wife, frightened.
Please, help me.
Battered, nowhere to go. Children killed or kidnapped because they wanted to go to school.
I'm being kicked. We're being detained right now.
Citizen journalists detained under new terrorism laws. Others abducted and tortured for political dissent. Minority groups targeted because of their religion. Indigenous peoples stripped of their livelihood as multinational corporations plunder their environment. Women denied their rights to pass their nationality on to their husbands or children. Nearly 1 billion people worldwide with not enough to eat. Mothers forced to choose between feeding their children or keeping them warm. And from street children to veterans, no place to call home.
Human misery and human rights are very much interconnected. And unless we find ways of dealing with the underlying causes of those, we won't be able to bring about change. The right to health, the right to education, the right to economic well-being, all of these are part of what people want everywhere.
During World War II, 60 million people were killed. 15 million died in battle. The other 45 million were civilians. In the wake of these horrors, the world vowed never again.
We stand today at the threshold of a great event.
To make that hope a reality, the UN established the Commission on Human Rights in 1946. Under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, a committee of 18 members from every corner of the globe participated, including China, Iran, Australia, the Soviet Union, France, Panama, India, and Uruguay. After 2 years of thoughtful debate, they created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was then adopted by 56 countries.
And without any direct opposition, this Assembly has adopted this very important declaration.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere.
The Preamble. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world.
Human rights to me means everyone being on equal footing and having what they need. Because we're all human, we're all the same species, so why don't we all have the same rights?
I think every right is equal.
All humans are equal, they have the same needs and the same right.
The right to vote, to assemble.
The right of expression.
Civil rights, political rights.
To love whom I want to love.
Choosing the person we want to spend our life with.
Women's rights.
The right to be able to work.
A right to clean air, right to water, right to education.
Food, water, shelter.
Food, clothing, shelter, and basic health care.
Peace. حقوق الإنسان حقه بركي بالحرية، حقه بأنه يعيش بكرامته، حقه بأنه يعيش بسلام.
The right to live free from fear.
They are something that we can't live without.
When the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was first written, it was really thought about as a holistic approach to what it means to be human. And so civil and political rights, the rights to free speech, the rights to not be tortured, were considered at the same level as economic, social, and cultural rights. And they were also considered indivisible. You couldn't have one without the other. So it's not just the rights that are indivisible, but our lives are indivisible. We don't have one aspect of our life that eats and the other one that can vote. We do both.
And yet the indivisibility of rights continues to be contested by those who don't believe that all humans deserve all human rights, either in the name of religion, cultural tradition, or simply the desire for power.
What we see throughout history in different countries, in different contexts, is that some are more human than others, and some are more entitled than others. And women have always been seen as less entitled than men, less human than.
I invite the Tehran Conference to seize the opportunity of a unique worldwide gathering to make a decisive contribution.
As the 20th century marched on, the UN continued its quest to bring governments together to address human rights issues.
Which is the foundation of human rights.
Historically, the West focused more on political rights, while the developing countries wanted more attention on social, economic, and cultural rights.
It is a forbidding task, un droit de l'espace.
At the first International Conference on Human Rights held in Tehran in 1968, they asserted their demands. The conference concluded with a proclamation reaffirming the commitment to the universality and indivisibility of all rights. And throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, momentum was strong. Many important treaties and UN conventions were adopted.
The Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women.
The World Declaration on the Survival, Protection, and Development of Children.
At the same time, women were also organizing and demanding gender equality.
The message to the women of the world is, arise. I would like to welcome you to this really historic event.
In 1975, the UN convened the first Global Women's Conference in Mexico City to craft a world plan of action.
It is the first intergovernmental meeting in the world.
The conference gave women the critical opportunity to begin building international coalitions. In the 2 decades that followed, subsequent conferences helped women to broaden their agenda and to raise awareness of women's rights issues. In 1993, at the UN Human Rights Conference in Vienna, women activists succeeded in getting violence against women formally recognized as a human rights abuse.
We began to talk about things like, at what point does domestic violence become torture? If a woman is confined to her home, if she's beaten regularly, if she has no access to leaving, these are all fundamental issues of torture and abuse. And it was really a turning point for the human rights community in recognizing that women's rights as human rights wasn't just a slogan, that it was about the life and death and abuse of women all over the world.
We are witnessing worldwide barbaric abuses against women. Now, some say this is all cultural. There is nothing we can do about it. I say it's criminal, and it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to stop it.
But just as women's rights were finally gaining international attention, the unthinkable happened.
Oh my God.
With nearly 3,000 people killed, a nation mourned, and a government responded. And the world we knew would never be the same.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
Terrorism became the dominant issue, and national security the top priority. Governments worldwide shifted to hard security measures and counterterrorism tactics.
Ordinary people voluntarily give up on some of their liberties because of the fear of what can happen. It's precisely the fear of terror that countries are able to impose measures that infringe on liberties and rights. It's as dangerous as counterterrorism.
The U.S. Congress passed the Patriot Act, giving law enforcement sweeping powers to bypass basic civil rights. Others quickly adopted similar legislation.
the pace of anti-terror operations has stepped up across Europe.
Of course, they were seen as necessary for security, but some of the legislation in the Middle East, North Africa especially, made a complete autocracy the norm.
Worldwide, regimes began using anti-terrorism laws to curb political dissent. Prior to 9/11, there were a few hundred arrests on charges of terrorism in the world. In the decade following 9/11, there were 120,000. 35,000 of them were convicted. Some for actual terrorist acts, but many more simply for carrying a political sign or blogging about a protest. The two countries with the most convictions, Turkey and China.
Tonight, what if the Constitution no longer applies?
Our federal government is keeping track of every phone call we make.
Extremely invasive spying programs that the public still does not know about.
And in the West, lines became increasingly blurred between civil rights and state security. Drones were also introduced as a new weapon of war.
The idea that you can hunt somebody down through drones and kill them without charge or trial, sentence, or any kind of determination. This is an outrage.
Drone attacks have killed thousands. Some were terrorists, others, innocent civilians.
The photographs were shot at the Abu Ghraib prison.
Many Americans will be disgusted by what they see.
Headlines around the world labeled the acts atrocities.
And the damage to U.S. interests in the rest of the world is hard to calculate, but it will be significant.
It moved us backward in terms of the assumption that some human rights issues were unquestionable. Because before that, there was a sense that human rights had a certain grounding, that there were some things that were undeniable, and we were pushing to make more things, like violence against women, undeniable. So on that level, it really shifted the government's willingness to trade off human rights for security.
It's a problem because many other governments around the world take their cues from the US. We've talked to government officials in many countries where we complain about unfair trials, we complain about torture, we complain about bad detention conditions, restrictions on civil liberties, and so on. And they basically say Guantanamo Bay, or they say Bagram, or they say Abu Ghraib, and that seemed to provide a justification.
According to the Amnesty International, many Kenyans actually would condone torture if it were for the public good.
In the Amnesty survey, 3 in 4 people in China and India said torture was sometimes needed.
And a new poll reveals what to some is an uncomfortable truth.
Half of all Americans believe that torture is okay during interrogation.
There was a time when it would be impossible to articulate the possibility of a nation to uphold the use of torture or to consider it in terms of its effectiveness rather than in the sense of human rights. And this is an indication that our values have changed.
Since 9/11, the Middle East North Africa region has been embroiled in a non-stop series of conflicts. The reasons are complex and many. Infrastructure has been decimated. Sectarian violence has escalated sharply. Economies weakened, leaving a multitude of young people without jobs or purpose. The unresolved Palestinian crisis. Regime change and political oppression. A region awash with guns and weapons, now in the hands of Islamic jihadists that are seizing wealth and resources, including a new barbaric strain of violent extremists who target women and children. They not only promote rape, they profit from sex trafficking and forced marriages.
One says the price goes up if women have blue eyes.
These videos attract certain people, young people.
And through the effective use of social media, they are successfully recruiting the alienated and disenfranchised to join their jihadist scourge.
These people have no borders. The struggle against extremists, fundamentalists, this kind of terrorism is a global struggle.
Just look at what is happening in Syria. When the conflict first started, there was an opportunity to deal with the issue. It was a peaceful movement at the beginning. But states were not able to multilaterally come up with a common solution, and today you have a full-fledged civil war there.
And the human toll has been enormous. More than 2.5 million refugees fleeing violence have flooded Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Nowhere to go, no money, no jobs. And families desperate for survival are compelled to sell their daughters for marriage to men who fly in from the Gulf. What the families hope for is a chance to give their daughters a better life. Sadly for many, it often doesn't work out that way. The worldwide cost of the war on terror is difficult to estimate, but in the United States alone, the estimate is well over $3 trillion. And counting. But the threat of terrorism is real.
For the people of France, it was 54 hours of anguish.
Multiple explosions in London.
Of course, the security side is important, but that is not the solution. No amount of security by itself will save us from terrorism. What we need is bring about change, real change. And a lot of it has to come through education, it has to come through empowering people, it has to come through alleviating poverty. It's not easy, of course it is not easy.
What we're asking for is an investment in human security, in the security and safety and dignity of people, not in more arms that are actually a threat to people.
Security, to me, the first thing I think of is knowing that I'm going to be able to find my next meal.
It means to have a balanced life.
Having the basic necessities.
I should have electricity 24/7 in my country.
To go to schools, not worrying about an explosion.
A job that can actually pay me a good salary.
The ability to move around and not be afraid.
That I have a roof over my head.
That peace of mind.
Just feeling safe.
To be able to walk on the street without thinking that I might be getting chased.
Security is everything.
Since the whole world started this battle against terrorism and counterterrorism, they ignore totally that full respect for human rights is one very important tool to fight terrorism.
It's amazing what we're seeing here, because we never thought women would actually go out in Libya. It shows how much women want to speak out in this revolution.
The spark that ignited the Arab Spring was a cry for dignity. Women, side by side with men, from one country to the other, demanded an end to oppressive regimes.
All of these people have come out today to say we're not scared, we will not be silenced, and you will not keep us off the streets of our country until our country is totally free.
They wanted freedom.
I'm living in a free city and hopefully in the future a free country.
They wanted what all people want, their human rights.
We have proven that we can take this country forward.
But without a shared vision, and the understanding of how to build a democratic society, they were outmaneuvered by religious fundamentalists who claim God is on their side.
There has never been an example around the globe of fundamentalist, extremist, conservative, Islamist, evangelical, you name them, in power, and people's human rights have thrived. We know very well that the first thing that religious fundamentalists do is curbing human rights, particularly curbing women's rights.
But the patriarchal structures and cultural norms that impede human rights are not easy to change.
People make culture, and people can change culture. But it does take contesting the values that are wrong, dialoguing and bringing about community to sit together and look at these issues, and then to say, how do we move together to bring about this change? It's a process, it takes a long time, but it has to be done if we want to ensure that human rights are really basics as part of everyday life.
It also takes understanding cultural context and providing education and training to understand what human rights are and how to advocate for them.
I think it's best for women to try to be organized. There is no dignity when you cannot put bread on the table for starving children, when you don't have medicines for a dying child. These are the kind of things that we need to understand, that women profoundly have the answers if we'll only listen as to how we make the changes in society. That's why training those women's groups is so important.
Women are becoming activated and engaged in a way that really has only developed in our time in the last 20, 30 years at a global level. And I think it is time for women to really think about how can we bring humanity back into a better relationship to itself, to its rights, to its community.
In the last 20 years, we've built an impressive architecture of human rights institutions. I think that we've got to actually light the fire in civil society, push to create the political space that allows us to make these rights real on the ground.
In the 20th century, it was acts of destruction and inhumanity that led the world on its quest to ensure universal human rights for all. In the 21st century, we have witnessed the erosion of those rights. Now, the challenge is to renew that quest and once again put forward the best of humanity.
We have to think about both the challenges that we're facing and not forget the opportunities. There's so many means of bringing knowledge to people, bringing a sense of oneness with the other, a sense of empathy. We just have to get our act together, work together, and when we see things which are wrong, to speak out. The answer is action.
We're not asleep. We see what's going on.
Solidarity and idealism. A way of making idealism a cool thing again.
So here I stand, one girl. I speak not for myself, but for those without voice can be heard.
Mugano. Mugano.
I am worth more. I know my rights and I'm willing to fight for them.
They thought that the bullet would silence us, but they failed.
Bunun için bir araya gelmek. Ama korkuyorum benim. Hayır.
I'm no longer afraid.
And out of that silence came thousands of voices.
Que nos están quitando todos nuestros derechos.
They're taking away all our rights.
We need to stop this issue now.
We have to finish.
And it is possible.
If we have hope, miracle will happen.
It's possible. We just have to believe that it is.
Some will say this is impractical, or too expensive, or too hard, or maybe even impossible. But it is time the world thinks bigger.